Hello, I'm Tan Morpin, Honorary Secretary to the Malaysian Society of Geriatric Medicine and a Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Malaya. It is a great honor to be able to introduce three giants of geriatric medicine for this Malaysian Congress of Geriatric Medicine Asia Pacific Geriatric Conference co-badged meeting, and for this breakout session entitled A New Horizon to Holistic Approach to Older People Care. Our first speaker is Professor Chen Liangkong, who will be giving us a talk on intelligence-based medicine, the revolution of artificial intelligence in geriatric medicine. First of all, let me introduce Professor Chen. Professor Chen Liangkong is a professor at the Aging and Health Research Center, National Yang Ming Chiao Tung University. He attended the National Yang Ming University School of Medicine, gaining his MD in 1996 and completed his PhD at the Institute of Health, Welfare and Policy at National Yang Ming University. He continued to extend his research from biomedical domain to aging and public policy, and currently works as the Director of Aging and Health Research Center, National Yang Ming University, as well as the Superintendent of Taipei Municipal Gandao Hospital, managed by the Taipei Veterans General Hospital in 2021. Professor Chen has had a very long accolade of research as well as medical leadership achievements. He is the editors and editorial members of board members of several local and international journals, has published over 350 peer-reviewed articles in geriatrics and gerontology. Indeed, Professor Chen is Asia's pride when it comes to geriatric medicine and is actually an everyday name mentioned in international circles in geriatric medicine. Our next speaker is Professor Leon Flicker, who will be giving us a talk on the 5 M's, revisiting geriatric giants. Professor Leon Flicker actually requires no introduction when it comes to Malaysia, but for the youngsters who haven't yet got to know him, he has been the Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Western Australia since 1998. He is Executive Director of the Western Australia Centre for Health and Ageing, and he led the reorganisation of undergraduate and postgraduate education in geriatric medicine in Western Australia. He remains a practising geriatrician and is a consultant geriatrician at the Royal Perth Hospital. Leon's research activities are focused on the major health issues of older people, including falls, depression, and cognitive impairment. He has performed and reported many studies about frailty and successful aging and has published 15 book chapters and 450 peer-reviewed articles. He has served on numerous government committees and professional organizations and has been chair of the Asia Pacific Geriatric Medicine Network for the last 14 years. He was honoured to receive an Officer of the Order of Australia for his contributions to geriatric medicine and dementia prevention and care. Our third talk this morning will be delivered by Dr. Edward Chong Ka Chun, and he will be speaking to us on best practices in managing patients with frailty in the emergency department. Dr. Edward Chong is a consultant at the Department of Geriatric Medicine at Tan Tock Seng Hospital and Head of Geriatric Medicine Continence Services. He's also the Program Lead for Emergency Department Interventions for Frailty, or EDIFI. Dr. Edward Chong is a consultant for the Department of Geriatric Medicine, Tan Tock Seng Hospital. He graduated with a degree in Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery from the University of Liverpool, United Kingdom in 2008. He has also successfully obtained certification in MRCP UK in 2012 and the Geriatric Medicine Specialty Certificate Examination in 2015. His clinical and research interests include continence care in older persons, frailty, and front door geriatric care. He is currently the Program Lead of the Front Door Geriatric Service in Tan Tock Seng Hospital and also known as the Emergency Department Interventions for Frailty, EDIFI, and a board member of the Society for Continence in Singapore. So without further ado, let's hear Professor Chen Liangkong talk
Good morning, all the participants of the APGC. This is Dr. Chen from Taiwan National Yangming Jiao Tong University and Taipei Veteran General Hospital. It is a great pleasure and honor to share with you about some of our research focused on the artificial intelligence. So this is the topic regarding to the intelligence-based medicine, the revolution of artificial intelligence in aging medicine. Artificial intelligence is not a new thing. It has been developed since the year 1950s. But in the meantime, the hardware limitation and of course the software development is not as good as now. So it was just a dream for the computer scientists. They are hoping to build an artificial intelligence so that to facilitate human beings to make some decisions. But gradually, the progress in the development of artificial intelligence has been coming to our lives. For example, if you're traveling internationally, the autopilot system on the plane is part of the artificial intelligence. And if you are in your office, you set up your air conditioner. It's kind of artificial intelligence because you set the temperature, the sensor will censor the temperature in your room. Then the air conditioner will going to adjust the work it is doing so that to reach the target temperature. And then in the 80s, more and more artificial intelligence has been applied to our daily lives, like the junk mail that in your email, there will be, from day to day, there will be a lot of junk mail. So sometimes it will be a waste of your time. And gradually, the mail server, they provided some algorithm so that to distinguish which one are the potentially the junk mail based on some setup rules or the behavior you have done before. For example, you always delete certain type of mail, then you will be categorized into the junk mail. And about 10 years ago, the progress of the hardware and especially the development of the deep learning process that makes artificial intelligence much more feasible. Especially in the previously, the artificial intelligence focused on some process that of the fixed mission. But nowadays, the deep learning are really able to capture the features based on a lot of informations like the pictures or a lot of behavior or even the recordings, so that to capture the feature of certain matter that we want to do it. So that makes the artificial intelligence much more easier and feasible in our daily life. But what about in our medical practice? That is not just the computer science. If you trace back the journal in the Nature, a few years ago, there is a paper in the cover story saying that artificial intelligence has come to our life in the medical practice because it can provide the as accurate diagnosis as the top leading dermatologist in making a diagnosis of skin cancer. The accuracy reaches over 90%. But sometime later, in a small column of Nature, it was written that the microbiologist used the machine learning process so that they can identify over 6,000 new species of virus on the earth. So as a clinician, when we look at the two reports from the same journal, Nature, what is the most attractive part? For the cover story, basically, it is a triumph of the computer science that the computer scientists, they really did it. They dreamed to have an artificial intelligence approaching human behavior. So the success of the computer scientists make the artificial intelligence possible, being applied to a lot of different missions in our daily life. But to me, as a clinician or the scientist in clinical medicine, I'm more excited about the microbiologist, because using the new analytic skill, the artificial intelligence, either machine learning or deep learning, so that we can have a real breakthrough in the life science or in medicine. So to me, this is the most attractive part, instead of having the artificial intelligence making the diagnosis for physicians. In clinical medicine, sometimes physician is like the fortune teller. In most of the time, we look at the patients and then we collect their informations, and using our knowledge regarding to clinical medicine, making the judgment and the prescription and the prognosis. Among the whole process, there are a lot of predictions. Making diagnosis kind of prediction based on the available information, and prescribing certain medication is kind of prediction because you're hoping the patient is getting better through the treatment, but you don't know. But based on your available knowledge, you think and you predict using that specific medication is helpful. And then in the follow-up, you check if the patient really improved from your prediction. So medicine per se is a very predictive scenario. So physicians are always making prediction based on his or her knowledge. So it's very similar to the artificial intelligence. But however, medicine is not that simple. If you look at the stories that are published in Nature, you know that the skin cancer is kind of, because in the artificial intelligence, data scientists need a very clear label that whether the patient is a patient or not. So the cancer is usually the top priority in developing the algorithm, because the cancer cell differs from the normal cell. But however, if you look at a lot of diseases, that's not that easy. So this is 1,500 years ago. It's an emperor in Chinese history. And in his late life, he developed the symptoms like this: thirst, frequency, and wasting. And nowadays, we know that's diabetes. But at that time, the physicians are not having specific treatment for the diabetes. So a lot of royal physicians never return home because they're killed by the emperor, and since they failed to cure him. But this emperor would not be the first person who had diabetes in the human history. So if you look at the human history back in 3,500 years ago, in a very ancient Egyptian doctor who has ever described the symptom of diabetes is saying that some pharaoh had the symptoms of polyuria and wasting, and then no more description. About 1,500 years later, so another Greek doctor mentioned that wasting is part of the muscle wasting, and that those muscles are degraded into urine. So they found that those patients had some specific character in the urine, probably due to the sweetness or something. So that's the understanding of diabetes at that time. And about 1,000 years later, in the 11th century, there is a very noble profession being developed, which is called a water taster. Because at that time, physicians already know the diabetic patient has their urine is much more sweeter than the normal person. But the problem is how to quantify the sweetness. So we need something who has very precise tongue, so that to quantify the sweetness of the urine. So that profession was called water taster. And humans use this kind of approach to quantify the sweetness of the urine for hundreds of years, until the 19th century, that we can, through the chemical approach, to detect sugar in the blood and in the urine. So that takes 3,500 years for humans to know about diabetes, even though that the treatment for the insulin is just about 200 years. And another challenge is that when you know diabetes patient having higher blood glucose or the urine glucose, the problem is how to define who is the patient who is not. So using epidemiology is one approach. So you had a large sample of persons having their blood sugar tested. So you will find it is a very famous bimodal distribution that on the right side, the peak is that belongs to the patients. So those who had a higher blood glucose, but probably you can also notice for their normal distribution of the normal subject and the diabetic subject, eventually to some part, they did overlap. So it's difficult to differentiate who is patient or who is not. Nowadays, we're using outcome-based to define the cutoff. So then we say 126 milligram per deciliter defines diabetes. But eventually, it's kind of agreement between different diabetes societies. It's hard for you to say a person with a fasting glucose 125 is not diabetic, or a person who has a fasting glucose 127 is definitely diabetes. There is always some overlapping that we are not quite sure of. But this is a relatively simple condition. If you back to the artificial intelligence, we need to label person with certain conditions so that computer can start to learn. So if you're not able to label something specifically, the machine will encounter some difficulties. So diabetes is one example. They are not always 100% sure for your label. But this is a relatively easier condition for diabetes. What about in neurodegenerative conditions? This is Parkinson. So back in a very famous study using the autopsy to report to confirm the Parkinson disease of certain individuals. So after they confirmed the diagnosis of Parkinson disease, they went back to the medical record. So they found that maybe back in 10 years ago, before the autopsy, the patient developed symptoms already. And the clinician, the neurologist, making the accurate diagnosis for Parkinson's disease is only 26%, which means that when those degenerative disease in the insidious onset process, physicians are not able to make a very accurate diagnosis. Even though you have time and medication treating your patient, seeing the clinical response, you treat the patient for 5 years, your accuracy rate is only up to 53%. You need to treat the patient for over 10 years so to get the accurate diagnosis over 85%, which means that in this kind of degenerative disease, it's very, very difficult to label a person with certain disease with high accuracy. That also makes the artificial intelligence more difficult because your labeling is from the physician are not necessarily right. But what about aging? Aging is a process mixing a lot of factors, the biological factors, disease factor, function, and the psychosocial, a lot of things all together. So in the scheme proposed by the Heidegger, the philosopher from Germany, he proposed that eventually aging is a process of kind of suffering. That being a human being, unlike the lions or tigers, you have some basic vulnerability. You cannot run faster than them. You're not as strong as those animals. So you have a basic vulnerability because of your human nature. And then you also have some variable vulnerability. When you're a kid, you're not able to get food on your own. So you have to depend on persons. So that's your vulnerability, and which is similar thing when you're getting older. But in a whole aging process, the vulnerability eventually varies by different factors, biological, disease, and social factors. So in the whole aging process, that's a very, very difficult thing, even in medicine or philosophy, to clearly define the age or aging process, not to mention the artificial intelligence, because we are not able to provide the accurate labeling. So in our study, we try to utilize the artificial intelligence, either machine learning or deep learning, to improve our understanding about aging. So we have to stick on one specific hypothesis or the proposal to develop our studies. So based on the WHO World Report on Aging and Health, the new scheme for aging process is the healthy aging. The idea for the healthy aging, and the whole thing about healthy aging is related to the functional ability and the intrinsic capacity. So the intrinsic capacity is the major domains about your health that can promote healthy aging or enable you to live independently in your late life. So those factors include mobility, locomotion, cognitive, vitality, sensory function, and so on. So that's your major determinant of your health in the late life during your whole aging process. Because WHO took the life course approach, it's not specifically started from certain age. So it's a whole progressive progress. So maybe for someone whose peak of the intrinsic capacity is 35, some are 40, some are 50. But however, that disregard of the specific age, people should be getting older in this kind of trajectory. You have declining intrinsic capacity, but as well as your functional ability. But the functional ability can be modified by the environmental factor or the assistive technology. So altogether, you can try your best to live independently in your late life, getting the best well-being. So it is a functional-based approach instead of simply a disease approach. So it's a very complicated thing, but a very good example is the a model in China who had a lot of muscle in his 80s that he was doing the actor. He do a lot of different movies or the TV drama and a lot of performance on the stage because he started to train his muscle since his age of 57. So we're trying to maximize his functional ability by training his muscle. So that really changes the stereotype that we know about a person at his 80s. So our research using the artificial intelligence is kind of schemed like this. We're using the existing data plus the new data that to generate a new algorithm to establish the new rules for healthy aging. So the first example is sarcopenia. We know that sarcopenia has been defined as a specific disease that the feature are the loss of muscle mass plus loss of muscle strength or physical performance. So it is very age-related phenomenon. It's an age-related disease, and the problem and the challenge of making a correct diagnosis of sarcopenia is that you have to measure a lot of things: the muscle mass, hand grip, and the like walking speed or the 5-time chair rise test, especially measuring the muscle mass. That currently, of course, there are some recommended protocols or the instrument, but not everything is 100% surely true. So using DEXA has its own problem. And if you're using MRI, there's another challenges. But however, we try to get some most applicable instrument in the clinical practice to get the accurate measurement as much as possible. So currently, we need to depend on the DEXA or the BIA, which is a multi-channel BIA, to measure the muscle mass together with other functional measurements. So we're thinking, is it possible for us to diagnose sarcopenia through a simple blood testing? Whether there is very accurate biomarkers that we can diagnose sarcopenia. So we go back to our basic research. Now, everybody knows that in our serum, there are plenty of proteins. So there are so many kinds of protein, probably over millions. And every individual protein or peptide may or may not have some physiological function. But at least those proteins secreted from certain organ playing the role as the biomarker or the signaling molecule to communicate between organs. So in those serums, if we can identify the specific protein or peptide that is strongly related to the development of sarcopenia, that can help us to easily to identify people at risk or who are sarcopenic. So in our cohort study, we have over probably 2,000 cases aged from 50 and older. And we collect all their blood samples, including the proteomics analysis. So everybody's serum has been tested for all those proteins using the mass. So that we can get all those protein fragments of every individual in the blood. But it is very difficult for us to do the analysis in the past, because if you are using the traditional biostatistic, it's not possible for you to identify one specific protein from the millions of items of protein or peptides. If you conduct simply student t-tests, you will get probably over 100 or even 1,000 different proteins with the p-value less than 0.005. But that does not really helping. That's not helping that we're not able to get a correct information from the 100 or even 1,000 different proteins. So we're using the machine learning that can help us to identify the most the candidate protein with very high likelihood to be associated with sarcopenia. So we found a new protein. We call it Q7Z2, and it has been cloned before, but the function remained unknown. So we're thinking whether this is a good biomarker for sarcopenia or frailty. So we're using this fragment of protein to test another cohort sample. And we did find that for the frail older person, the serum level of Q7Z2 is much higher than the non-frail older person. So it could be at least one very important biomarkers for frailty and sarcopenia. But the most challenging thing is that we spent 3 months using the machine learning to identify the Q7Z2 protein. But we spent more than 3 years back to the lab doing the experiment, trying to find out what is this protein, what this protein is, and what's the major physiological function that we're still working on that. But it's a combination of using basic sciences and the artificial intelligence. Another example is our cohort. All of our participants have 3T brain MRI, and that is that's the unstructured data, not like the blood testing or a lot of questionnaire-based things. It's just a figure, so it's a picture for the brain with different modalities. So you can have, for one single person, there can be hundreds of different pictures captured by the MRI. So we're thinking, can we use those unstructured imaging features to identify or to predict the age of a person? Whether using this platform we call the brain age, we can predict the adverse outcome and the diseases. So the answer is positive, that we have published a paper already saying that the normal older person, eventually their brain structure, the brain age being calculated by the artificial intelligence are quite different from the person with different diseases like major depression, schizophrenia, or Alzheimer's disease. But something is true, that if you have older brain age, you're more likely to die or having the Alzheimer's disease compared to those with younger brain age. So that is highly sophisticated artificial intelligence research using a lot of different algorithms in machine learning and deep learning. But that makes us possible to approach the biological age that we geriatricians have thought of for many years to build up this platform. Then we achieved this specifically using the brain MRI to get a brain age. But what about the daily practice, which is more practical? That everybody knows that the current wearable devices are getting more and more likely to have your a lot of vital signs measurements, blood pressures, pulse, even ECG, or even the blood glucose. So it is not available yet, but it is soon. Some papers tell us that eventually for a person like on the top, the Mr. A, the patient's HbA1c is about 8%, but the one below, the Mr. B, also had the HbA1c of 8%. But the problem is, if you look at their measurement of their plasma glucose at different times, you will see a lot of variations for Mr. A. Eventually, in your daily practice, the two persons are of the same risk because they are having the same HbA1c. But the variations, today we call it glycemic variability. The variations are very different, and are they still of the same risk? The answer is no. Some papers tell us that even though person with the same HbA1c, if the variation is bigger, they're having poorer clinical outcomes like the AMI or others. So variation is very important, but variation can only be measured with wearable devices, not like the clinical practice. So medicine has moved from the average to the real-time measurements. So we have conducted one study using 500 smart watch, so that to collect the information for 500 older persons. And overall, the behavior of using the smart devices means something. For those who regularly get their data transmitted back to our computer, showing that in the 1 year follow-up process, they gain about 0.5 kilogram of their body weight, and their blood pressure drop about 5 millimeter mercury, and the walking speed is slightly faster, and the frailty status is lower, and they're getting less depressed. So, and also the nutritional status, that is just related to whether a person are willing to wear the wearable devices. For those who are willing to wear wearable devices in 1 year follow-up, they are getting better in terms of physical and nutritional, even the blood pressure and their depressive moods. But if we dig deeper, that we try to get some analysis using the machine learning based on the real-time data collected from the smartwatch, that we found that the inactive persons eventually in 1 year follow-up who had a 52% greater risk of cognitive decline in 1 year follow-up. And the sleeping pattern is also related to the depressive symptoms. Those can become very important potential digital biomarkers for us physicians to look at our patients, trying to get more information of them. So what about in the healthy promotion? There are a lot of activities has to be introduced to our older persons, but the problem is even those programs are effective, we need a lot of things to get it done. We need a lot of manpower, we need funding, we also need incentive for them to participate for those activities. What about making it into a video game-based intervention? It's possible. A recent paper published by the McGill showing that the video games like the Mario, eventually you play Mario for 6 months, eventually you can relatively increase the volume of hippocampus. So in Taiwan, we also started this program. This is the picture of the founder of the Acer computer, Stan, and he participated himself in this program, showing that when you're playing video games using the functional MRI, the blood flow of the cerebellum and the hippocampus are increased. So now our ecosystem of medical practice of the healthy aging process can be modified into a more precision healthy aging process that all your real-time daily health information can be integrated together with your medical record or your dietary pattern all together, even to work with the insurance company to change your insurance policy and the premium for all your behaviors. So if your behavior is moving towards healthy aging, you can get some discount in your next year premium. So this is the last slide that for geriatricians in the future, we need to use more, not just biomarkers, but also the digital biomarkers. So it will be digital and biomarkers integration in the aging medicine, not just in practicing for the geriatric field, but also in a healthy aging scheme that for people who are relatively younger, but who are at risk of functional decline. So thank you very much. This is my talk to share with you.
I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak about this subject, which is an interesting one for me, and how much I'm enjoying, once again, being involved with the Asia Pacific Geriatric Network. And I've retitled my talk to Revisiting the Geriatric Giants. Now, many of you will know that this is where I keep the attention of my audience, and so this is the summary of what I'm going to be talking about today, and you can now go off and do something else. I'll be talking about Bernard Isaac's The Geriatric Giants, which is the original giants of geriatrics, and that was largely based on the letter I. Then I'm going to be talking about the Geriatric 5 M's, which is a simplified communication framework to describe core competencies in geriatrics, and that's based on the letter M. I'm going to discuss my view that frailty is as the scientific basis for geriatric medicine, and I'm going to propose that we should just have one giant, and that should be frailty, and 3 subdomains: physical, cognitive, and social. So let's start. This is Bernard Isaacs. He lived between 1924 and 1995. He was one of the early pioneers of geriatric medicine in the United Kingdom. His initial consultant post was in a former workhouse, which is what we would consider now a residential care facility, and that was in Glasgow in 1961, where he grew up. Between the years 1975 to 1989, he held the Charles Hayward Chair of Geriatric Medicine at Birmingham University. And he proposed in 1965, in a fairly influential book, although I can't actually see it in that book, 4 geriatric giants: immobility, instability, falls, incontinence, and intellectual impairment. At some stage, another giant was added to those 4 giants, and that was iatrogenic complications, largely due to medications. I think that probably this was popularised for several reasons. One, it certainly gained traction in the United Kingdom amongst geriatricians, and it was an interesting idea that had immediate appeal. But another reason was that these giants were further taken by Ron Cape in a small chapter in Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, possibly the 9th or 10th edition. And there he used the Olympic rings to describe the giants, and including now iatrogenesis. So we had immobility, instability, incontinence, intellectual impairment, and iatrogenesis. And these became the giants as popularised worldwide in both the US, UK, Australia, and much of Asia. So we go forward now some 50 years later, and we have a different process. And there we had two conjoint processes which started, at least initially, completely independently. So there was a US process that was occurring with the J.A. Harfoot Foundation, and there they were trying to map core competencies for the education and age-friendly hospitals. And so they had come up with a 4M framework, and at the same time, the University of Ottawa Division of Geriatric Medicine, as part of their strategic plan, had also come up with four giant competencies. And some of the materials that, and this is the 5 M's that eventually came out from Mary Tinetti in that conference in Canada in 2017. And there we see 5 M's, including mentation, dementia, delirium, depression, meant for the mind, mobility, impaired gait and balance, and 4 injury prevention, medications, polypharmacy, deprescribing, optimal prescribing, adverse medications effects and medication burden, multi-complexity with multi-morbidity and complex biopsychosocial situations, and what matters most, each individual's own meaningful health outcomes, goals and care preferences. And one of the clear directions that they wished to make was that it should be just on the fingers of one hand. So these 5 M's were what matters, the mind, multi-complexity, medications, and mobility. Now, the discussion leading to this was largely a description of communication to junior members of our specialty and also to external partners. So Frank Molnar was quoted as, to focus on concrete core elements of what we do, at least in our more detailed descriptions of our services, memorable for our partners in other specialties. Several have commented that after all these years, we finally understand your areas of expertise. And patients have had similar positive reactions. So this is the idea that this is a communication tool to other people, not necessarily experts. And Mary Tinetti, while we take pride in being experts in complexity, we must learn to communicate simply. We are adopting assessment and management of geriatric 4Ms, in this case of our training programs and the age-friendly health systems. Now, what both processes have observed is that there are some things that are clearly to do with the core business of geriatrics. And both the I and the M criteria both recognise this. And these are still apparent today. So here I have just 2 examples which consume a lot of the business of geriatrics. This is the incidence of fall-related emergency visits. And you can see that there's an exponential increase starting at the age of 55, and it continues through life. Slightly greater than for female versus male, but there's still a predominance in the older age groups. Next to it, I have the dementia prevalence in mainland China. And again, a very clear exponential increase from the age of 64. You can see that there's a clear exponential relationship with aging itself. And this is mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Now, even if we look at, for the dementia example, even if we look at the people before the age of 65, again, you can see that this takeoff is really just at the mid-50s, that prior to the age of 60, there are very few people with dementia, and it really is this exponential increase after the age of 60. So this raises the question of why do we have a situation where some conditions seem to be so age dependent? And this also then raises, well, what is the process of aging? And what I think is still the best hypothesis to deal with the fundamental view of aging is the disposable soma theory, popularised by Kirkwood over 20 years ago. This idea is that aging is not pre-programmed. It results from the accumulation of somatic damage, and that there is limited ability to repair that damage, so that eventually it causes widespread further complications. The accumulation of this somatic damage is stochastic in type and occurs randomly, and so therefore some people are better able to deal with that stochastic damage or insults better than others, purely because of their genetic and other background. And adverse gene actions that occur at older age may be because the genes escaped the force of natural selection because they had an advantage in younger age, the idea of pleiotropy, that the genes do more than one thing. And this idea is being popularized for aging for both cells, whole animals, and humans. Now, this is an article whose the lead author was Arnold Manitsky, and unfortunately Arnold passed away recently. Arnold was one of the great founders of frailty, working with Ken Rockwood for many years. This is one of his papers where he proposed a general and simple stochastic model to explain how the number of deficits in frailty can be represented by the product of the intensity of environmental stresses over time, and that the exponential increase in the number of health deficits with age directly corresponds to the exponential increase of recovery time. And this partly explains why we have residual damage following aging insults. So frailty is an inevitable consequence of aging. It characterises individuals at the limits of their physiological reserve in one or more homeostatic systems, such that any minor perturbation precipitates a cascade of events in multiple systems. And there's two major competing views of frailty, but actually these converge in most people. There's a specific phenotype of frailty, which is largely a sarcopenic view of frailty, popularised by Linda Fried 20 years ago. And then there's another approach which just uses this simple stochastic model. And again, this is probably more to do with what's happening today. Now, before we go on to what we do about frailty, let's just remember that what traditional medicine has practiced is the disablement process, where a specific pathology produces impairment, subsequently functional limitation, then disability and global outcomes. And we as clinicians and people involved in the system intervene at a number of different time points along this pathway. And this is the traditional view of both medical care and rehab, and also community action, that we are looking for specific pathologies producing known outcomes. And similarly, the World Health Organization in the International Classification of Functioning Disability in Health has that same sort of idea, that there's a health condition, it affects body functions and activities and participation, and that eventually interacts with environmental factors and personal factors changing the way that activities are able to be performed. Some time ago, I wrote about this in the British Medical Journal, pointing out that frailty is the most likely explanation of why geriatric interventions work. Now, this is the idea that it's different from those previous schema and structures that we use to associate health conditions with disability and handicap. Firstly, frailty is almost certainly mediated by both physiological ageing and multiple diseases associated with ageing, and that converges to syndromes of high prevalence. And these syndromes could be dementia, falls, depression, incontinence, and have been listed in both the 5M and the 5I frameworks. The accumulation of multiple insults over time and consequent reduction of homeostatic reserve has to be addressed by a comprehensive approach that includes all system and focuses on functional effects. So this again is one of the hallmarks of geriatric medicine. It's not just treating the most likely presenting problem, but all the other problems associated with the functional deficits. The loss of homeostatic reserve and the fact that we're treating multiple conditions almost certainly will result in increased risk of iatrogenic complications. The fact that when you're treating 2 or 3 conditions, you're very likely to have drug-drug interactions or drug-disease interactions, or alternatively even investigations that subsequently have complications. And this deficit accumulation is not just confined to physical insult. Life course events may also increase the susceptibility to illness and the need for psychosocial interventions. Now, one of the ways that we can deal with this, and this is sort of a holistic mechanism of dealing with the problems of frailty, and has been discussed as the World Health Organization on their healthy aging framework, is that there are several time points that we can intervene, and that precision medicine and of geriatric conditions is exactly the same as many other conditions, where we're maintaining intrinsic capacity, we're trying to look at both primary prevention, we're detecting certain populations who are at risk, and we're looking at secondary preventions, both for as part of multidisciplinary teamwork, but also as single interventions and multiple interventions in some of the basic problems such as sarcopenia. And these interpreventional interventions have been shown to work in many of our core conditions. I'm just going to go through a couple of examples illustrating this. This is firstly with falls, which is a classic example of frailty increasing over time, causing increasing instability. And so over time and age, possibly associated with new conditions, the ability to have reserve functioning or redundancy in your ability to do things diminishes, so that younger people are able to run across country, whereas older people may no longer be able to do cooking or shopping reliably and safely because of the increased instability that they manifest. This is an example which I think is very telling. This is an example in osteoporosis, which could be considered bone frailty. And one of the things about this which is interesting is that the adaptation to a problem may actually cause problems of its own. Because we lose bone as we grow older through perhaps both disease and physiological changes, the result is that the bones become bigger but have a smaller cortex. Now, this provides the same strength as the original bone because the smaller cortex because of the increased size, is able to resist the tensile forces. So this is just why your bicycle may have had a bigger and bigger frame in its tubing, because the larger the diameter of the bone, the stronger it will be to tensile forces. But it's at the expense that it is more likely to collapse or break when it's shattered by sudden impact, such as a fall onto a hip. So this is an example where the adaptation to aging may actually cause problems of its own. Now, the example I next want to go through is probably the most important, and this is dementia. Now, for those of you who've missed it, dementia of the Alzheimer's disease type has been defined by the World Health Organization in ICD-11, and this is due to be implemented in January next year. This is what the dementia of the Alzheimer's disease is thought to be due. It's the most common form of dementia. It's insidious in onset with memory impairment, typically reported as the initial complaint. The characteristic course is slow but steady decline from a previous level of cognitive functioning, with impairment in additional cognitive domains. It's often accompanied by mental and behavioural symptoms such as depressed mood, may be accompanied by psychotic symptoms, and positive genetic testing, family history, and gradual cognitive decline are highly suggestive of dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. Now, for over 20 years, we have known that dementia of Alzheimer's disease, which is going to remain for the next possibly 15 years under that criteria, that the most common pathological causes of this form of dementia are mixed pathology. And this study is a study from England, from Sava and colleagues, demonstrating that as you grow older, the ability of plaques and tangles are much less likely to differentiate those people who have dementia, the yellow on the top, versus the people without dementia. So there seems to be a clear separation for those people who died at the age of 70, that the plaques and tangles are strongly associated with dementia. But as you grow older into the 90s, they seem to be much less potent in differentiating the two conditions. Atrophy, on the other hand, seems to be stable in how it differentiates people with and without dementia. Lon White, some years ago, demonstrated the most common form of dementia, which is is mixed, and this was only in people who had died with what was thought to be of the dementia of the Alzheimer's type. And he described 5 separate pathologies, including plaques and tangles, but also vascular lesions, cortico-Lewy bodies, and a condition of hippocampal sclerosis, which remained unknown about exactly what was causing this. If we go now to the world today, we now know that hippocampal sclerosis was almost certainly associated with limbic predominant age-related TDP-43 encephalopathy, or late pathology. And this pathology is very, very common in people who have dementia of Alzheimer's type. We also know that chronic traumatic encephalopathy is an increasingly important and recognised condition associated with dementia in people of all ages, but also older age. And there are 2 new forms of tauopathy. Primary age-related tauopathy, again a common condition of older people and very older people. And age-related tau astrogliopathy, which again is very common in people over the age of 90. Now, people will say, well, dementia in 80 and 90-year-olds, that's not that important. In fact, the majority of people with dementia are over the age of 80, and certainly the majority of the people who participate in neuropathological studies are well over the age of 80. So this is the common type of dementias that we are seeing are caused by multiple pathologies. Just adding the late pathology, the TDP-43 pathology, you can see that in a series of people who have subsequently died with what was thought to be Alzheimer's disease dementia, Alzheimer's pathology does explain the major part of the dementia, about 40%, but vascular pathology explains 25%, late pathology explains 17%, and alpha-synuclein pathology, Lewy body pathology, explains 12%. So you can see that the mixture of pathologies, even without adding the tau pathologies that I've just described, seems to explain quite a lot of the dementia found in older people. On this basis, maybe we have been trying too hard to parcel out dementias into single conditions. And in fact, what we have is cognitive frailty, where people may come from being normal to severe dementia, and there is no clear demarcation for this path. That as we accumulate different types and amounts of pathology, which could be Alzheimer, Lewy body, vascular, late, tau pathology, we will see increasing cognitive frailty, eventually manifesting as mild or moderate dementia. This in-between condition then becomes fairly clear that we've accumulated some of this pathology, but it may not be typically just Alzheimer's pathology. It could be due to any of the other conditions. At the same time, we know that there are some conditions such that we associate with delirium which are potentially reversible. And so that explains why some people who are acutely sick seem to have dementia, but when they get better, they seem to have mild neurocognitive disorder with no functional impairment. And that can be easily explained once you think of people along this continuum. And so that leaves us to what could be the meaning of this, and how could we associate this with the geriatric giants? I would maintain that we only just need one geriatric giant called frailty, with three subdomains: physical frailty, social frailty, and cognitive frailty. And all three of these subdomains interact with each other, and the presence of two or more obviously increases the burden for the patient. Under physical frailty, we have sarcopenia, falls, immobility, incontinence, and susceptibility to iatrogenesis, especially drugs. Under cognitive frailty, we have dementia, mild neurocognitive disorder, delirium, and possibly depression. And under social frailty, which is yet to be defined fully, but some people have attempted to this, and I've used this definition coming from Bunt and colleagues, it can be defined as a continuum of losing or lost resources that are important for fulfilling social needs during the lifespan. So I'd like to conclude there. Our concepts of the geriatric giants was and is based on what is common in very old people. Bernard Isaacs based the concept on the five conditions associated with the letter I, and the geriatric 5Ms has described a simplified communication framework to describe the core competencies associated with geriatrics. I still believe that the concept of frailty is exciting and potentially taps into the scientific basis of aging and the conditions that we see as geriatricians. And maybe at this stage, we just need one giant frailty and three subdomains: physical, cognitive, and social. I'd be delighted to discuss this further with you during question time.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me to give this talk today. So I just want to thank the organizing committee of this conference. So I'm Edward. I'm the program lead for the Emergency Department Interventions for Frailty. So that stands for EDIFI. So I'll talk a little bit more about EDIFI later on. And also just say that to say hi to all my fellow Malaysians. I'm Malaysian myself, so I did half of my training at the International Medical University before I went over to the UK, graduated from the University of Liverpool, then worked there for about 4 years before I then head over to Singapore and completed my training as a geriatrician at Singapore. So without further ado, I'll just go through the outlines. So I'll be talking about geriatric care and why is it important that we have geriatric care delivered at the front door. And then I'll be presenting some evidence to support that notion. And then I'll move on to just share a little bit about how my experience in terms of delivering a frailty-centric service at the ED, and then some of my learnings from running a front door geriatric service. So to start off with, why geriatric care at the front door? Why is it important that we start right at the get-go of hospitalization? So we all know the world is aging, so I don't really need to elaborate this point. But just to briefly share, in Singapore, we have about 14.4% of our residents being 65 and above, and that was stats from 2019. And about 30.1% of patients attending the emergency department at Tan Tock Seng Hospital are 65 and above, and close to half of these individuals actually get admitted to an acute hospital ward. And if you look at just the 85 and above, the number goes up to about 70.9%. And then when you look at those that are admitted to hospital who are 85 and above, about 80.9% of these individuals are actually frail, and that's based on the clinical frailty scale of 5 or more. So we actually, a few years ago, we actually looked at frailty and how it is actually predictive of mortality, institutionalization, functional decline amongst these 85 and above who were admitted to hospital. And what we found is that if you were frail, you were 32.9% more likely to die as opposed to the non-frail, which was 2.5. You were also similarly very of higher risk of institutionalization as well as functional decline. And to add another dimension to the outcomes of hospitalization, if you looked at frailty and if you added on equity of illness. So in this study done by Kenneth Rockwood and his team, they looked at frailty coupled with the Canadian triage and equity scale. And if you looked at just the robust patients, regardless of whether they were more sick when they presented to the hospital versus they were not sick, they actually did pretty well in terms of the survival curve and probability. But if you look down here, the solid line represents more severe illness. You see there's a vast difference between those that are severely ill versus those that were not severely ill. And we now know that severity of illness actually plays a part in how well a patient outcome is when they go through hospitalization. So when I talked about hospital outcomes, I talked about severity of illness, I talked about frailty, baseline frailty, and how this actually influences outcome. And the next thing I like to talk about and highlight is actually the hazards of hospitalization, right? And the list on the left actually shows you all the different iatrogenicity as well as nosocomial complications that one may face when they get admitted to hospital. And it's very important to know that these are things that actually we could do something about early on. We could start certain measures early, even as early as at the front door in the emergency department, to try and mitigate the incidence of these things from happening, right? And even better, what if we could prevent the admission in the first place, right? If we can identify the right patients to discharge home so that they will not be subjected to these risks. So that's where front door geriatrics come in, all right? So evidence that we currently have, a lot of it still supports geriatric care, and this is in acute medicine, in acute hospital settings. There is evidence as well for front door medicine in terms of geriatric care and comprehensive geriatric assessment. It is getting more robust, but at the moment there's still not as much data to support it as we do for other areas of geriatric care. So in acute geriatric care, we know it's better than usual care, right? It leads to less functional decline and shorter length of stay. When you introduce comprehensive geriatric assessment into the assessment of older adults hospitalized, we know it can improve the likelihood of staying alive and also reduce institutionalization. And if you had ACE unit, which is an acute care for the elders unit, in place, we also know that that model of care can improve the less likelihood of causing functional decline, less likelihood of institutionalization as well. But what about in the ED setting? So I'll present some evidence to support that, but before that, I'll just talk about some care models. So if you look at the Geriatric Emergency Department guidelines, there are actually 4 care models that are currently available or being practiced in various different centers. So the first one being Geriatric ED unit. So this is a dedicated space in the ED with elder-friendly environmental enhancements. The advantage of this unit is that it is the right site and the right care for these patients, right? And you can then focus your staff training on the ED team within this unit. The sort of disadvantage in a sense is that it is resource intensive. You need to develop this unit. You need to design the infrastructure to be elder friendly. So it actually incurs costs, right? And at the same time, there may be some concerns about staff constraints where you've trained a group of staff that are skilled in geriatric care. But if there were any issues with shortage of staff is out because of MCs, etc., then you're not going to be able to bring in the ED staff that's outside the unit to support this unit due to their lack of expertise in providing the necessary care. The next one is actually geriatrics practitioner-led. So this is when you actually have geriatric experts coming down to the ED to provide the necessary care for patients. Right, so they will be provided the right care at a lower cost. But some of the disadvantages is that, again, it involves staffing, isn't it? So you need to pull manpower from the geriatric department, from the nursing department to support the A&E department. And sometimes that can be quite difficult when there's manpower constraints even within the geriatric department itself. So they may pull the geriatrician back, right, to the department, and then you will lose that support, right? And some are also worried that it might prolong ED stay because of the necessary assessments that are required to be performed on these patients. Then geriatric patient champion-led. So this is when you have ED physicians who are geriatric trained and ED nurses who are geriatric trained, playing the leadership role in initiatives and establishing care pathways. It leads to better care. I wouldn't say it's the right care, but definitely better care at a lower cost. And the disadvantage is that it does require training, right? There may be some challenges in coordinating care once the patient leaves the ED department because you do require quite a lot of collaboration with outpatient setting, with community partners, etc. And also you will have some limited multidisciplinary care because unless you're able to collaborate with the physiotherapists, the allied health, the nurses, the pharmacists, you won't be able to provide that holistic care. And lastly is sort of a combination of geriatric ED as well as geriatric practitioner-led, where you have this geriatric-centric short stay observation unit, right? And essentially you can provide right site, right care, and staff training can be focused within the staff within that unit. But it also can be very resource intensive. You need to develop the unit, the infrastructure, the training. The other disadvantage I experience when running such a unit is actually trying to identify the right patients. You don't always get it right because we know older patients tend to present atypically. Sometimes they may seem quite well, and you think maybe they can stay for a short duration, but something else creeps up along the way, and then you find that you have to actually do more tests. They need to be admitted to the acute wards subsequently as well. So you don't always get it right. So it's always that bit that's a little bit challenging when running a geriatric observation unit. Right, so certain papers have been published to support some form of geriatric care model at the ED. This paper from Australia, Tertiary Hospital in Queensland, actually ran a nurse-led physician champion surveys where they provided geriatric assessments, care coordination, etc. And they were able to actually show improved discharges, decreased ED length of stay, with no increase in mortality and no increase in re-presentations to the ED within 28 days. Up in the UK at Royal Bolton Hospital, they actually ran this acute frailty unit of 16 beds, and the patients were selected based on their frailty status, their age, as well as geriatric syndromes, and they were able to show that they could decrease length of stay quite significantly as compared to the national norms, right? 3.7 days versus 9 days. Majority of the patients were discharged home, and there were low readmissions rate, so 7.9% versus the national 15.5%. Perhaps closer to home, our colleagues at the Changi General Hospital were trying to work on a service where they could direct admissions away from acute wards to the subacute care unit via an ED short stay ward. So what they would do is actively try to identify the right patients at the ED itself and try and divert their admission towards the subacute care area. And they were able to show that they were quite successful in doing so. Right, 74.7% was the success rate in actually transferring patients over to the subacute care unit. And 11.9% actually discharged home directly from the short stay unit as well. And here at Tan Tock Seng Hospital, prior to Edify, which I'll talk about shortly, there was this other service called the Geriatric Emergency Medicine Service run by our ED physicians. And they were able to show that rapid geriatric assessments that were done by the ED nurses and championed by the ED physicians actually led to less ED readmissions and less hospitalizations as well. And they were actually identifying a lot of hidden needs, 71.7% of hidden needs that actually required intervention. Subsequently, there are other papers that actually even showed they were able to preserve function, both IADLs and ADLs, in this patient group as well. So the GEM service also conducts twice yearly GEM seminars, and is led by the ED physicians, and they've trained more than 100 GEM trained nurses by now. And so all these nurses have actually been trained to perform some form of geriatric assessment. Right, so if you haven't already heard, there is this network called the Acute Frailty Network in the UK. And this was actually designed as a collaborative improvement sort of model of care where they try to support hospitals across the UK to develop their own frailty-centric care model within the urgent care setting. One of the interesting things that they brought up was a way to sort of tackle frailty based on the CFS categories. So they actually divided patients into 3 broad categories: CFS 1 to 3, 4 to 6, as well as 7 to 9. And if you look at the CFS 1 to 3, the clinical considerations here is that you just provide usual treatment, include specialist care if needed, right? And your care pathway should be driven primarily by primary presenting problems. Then when you move on to the more frailer patients, the pre-frail to the frail ones, this is when you need to start looking for geriatric syndromes. And this is when you need to refer them to the right people, usually in an outpatient setting, if you're going to discharge a patient from ED. So they actually suggested considering case management in discharge planning to reduce the risk of readmission. The green text over there is what I've added on, where I would also even suggest, if resources allow, start some form of CJA, try and do some basic geriatric assessments at the ED. The rest of the CJA can be continued either in hospital if they're going to be admitted, or at home or in an outpatient setting where more robust evaluations can be conducted there. When patients get more frail, this is when you need to look out for geriatric syndromes because it's more prevalent. You need to ensure holistic care is available, and EOL scenarios are very common, end-of-life scenarios are very common. So this is when CJ should be delivered. You should at least be able to assess patients. But at the same time, you need to start having some early discussion about end-of-life care. And it can actually start from the ED itself. And in some EDs, Tan Tock Seng included, we actually try to bring up the discussion about ACP, about advanced care planning early, just to talk to them about it, share with them what ACP is, and if they're interested, we will even refer them to an ACP facilitator to have their ACP conversations carried out. So to conclude this part about geriatric care at the ED, we need to focus on frailty-centered care. And one of the key ways to do that is really to provide some form of comprehensive geriatric assessment at the ED floor itself, right? We need to somehow be able to maximize continuity of care. So once they're discharged, we need to make sure things are in place for them to be cared for in the community or in an outpatient setting. We need to minimize ward movement, which means, if possible, try to get them to the right side of care early and not send them from one place to acute care, to subacute care, to community hospital, where they are moved to in too many different places. And we know when an older person moves from one place to another, there's always that risk that they could, get delirium if they have cognitive impairment, etc. So try to minimize ward movement if you can. We need to have resources in place to build an infrastructure which is elder-friendly at the ED if possible. And last but not least, we need to minimize harm of hospitalization. And one way we can do it, on top of delivering early geriatric care at the ED, is to avoid the admission in the first place. So with that, I want to actually talk about Edify, which is the service that I run at Tan Tock Seng, right? And when I describe Edify, I usually describe it as bouncers at a club, right? So if you look at this diagram, you have this house representing the hospital system. You've got the front door, which is the A&E. You've got the inpatient setting, which is the hospital itself, and you've got the community, which is the patient's home, nursing homes, etc. In the traditional sort of system, you've got your transitional care that usually supports patients being discharged home. And you can look at it as us keeping a hold of their hands and then holding them as they go out through the back door and making sure they don't slip and fall on their way out back to the community. Edify is slightly different. We stand at the front and we look at a patient and ask ourselves, do you fit criteria to come into hospital in the first place? If you don't, we're going to take you around the corner. We will send you somewhere else, maybe a low acuity care area like short stay observation wards, subacute community hospitals. But if you don't need that kind of care, we could get you home. We could get you back to your nursing home. We could even send you to a hospice, and that has been something we have had to do for one or two of our patients who presented to ED as well. So our primary objective for Edify is to reduce the number of potentially avoidable acute hospitalizations. We had secondary objectives as well, which is to perform comprehensive geriatric assessment, as well as to provide awareness and education on frailty. Right, so we had two arms to our service, the first being the mobile team, and the second being the frailty unit, which is our observation unit. Right, we operated from Monday to Fridays, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And these are our team members. We had geriatricians, pharmacists, physiotherapists, medical officers, and very importantly, we have our advanced practice nurse, which does most of the heavy work, right? So who do we see? We see patients that were bound for admission, and if we deem that this patient could avoid an acute admission, we will intervene and try and get them away from the acute wards. We also provide a multi-component frailty intervention, and this is for younger patients at 65 and above who are pre-frail to frail to moderately frail, and they are planned for discharge from the ED observation unit. So I'll talk a little bit more about what entails the multi-component frailty intervention later on. So our APN actually screens all these patients and then decides who's suitable for intervention. And when suitable, we will review them, and then we will provide follow-up plans, telephonic reviews, discharge planning, as well as the multi-component frailty intervention. So when patients are discharged, what happens is they actually are provided early follow-ups. Telephonic reviews is when we would call the patient up and check on them, about 5 working days. And we will also give them a phone number to call our APN. If there's any problems, they can give them a call and they will try to help them with it. And lastly, we'll try to put them in touch with the right community care providers to support them back at home. So what is the multi-component frailty intervention package that we have, right? We target specifically CFS 4 to 6, right? Because we believe this is a group that perhaps would benefit most from these interventions. They will be provided geriatric assessments by the Edify. So some ways we'll start CGA. We provide them frailty counseling. So if you're interested, you can scan this QR code to get a free copy of it. We provide exercise advice, nutritional assessment. We get our pharmacists to do medication reviews and reconciliation. And if necessary, vitamin D screening and replacement, as well as geriatric follow-ups as well. The other side to our service is the observation unit, where we provide elder-friendly observation, up to 72 hours of care, and hopefully avoid the need for acute hospital admission. And this is just some photos of the unit. As you can see, it's very brightly lit. 2 beds, there's jerry chairs, and there's a window out there so that they can actually be hopefully be orientated to time, right? And then there are some photos, old photos for reminiscence, and then a large clock at the wall. We have a reorientation board as well as activity box to engage the patients. So this is just a photo of one of our patients actually engaging in some activities, building up sort of Jenga blocks, and the nurse supervising her. So how are we doing? On average, the geriatric department in Tan Tock Seng sees about 400 patients or 400 admissions in a month. And Edify actually screens about 40% of that, so about 160 per month. We review up to 8%, which is about 32 per month. And we are able to actually decrease acute admissions by about an average of 6%. So that's about 24 admissions per month. And our success rate, when we choose to review and intervene, our success rate is around 80 to 85%. Now, if I haven't convinced you enough, right, we have actually conducted 2 studies. One has been published on JAMDA, and the other is in the midst of being submitted for publication. So study 1 actually focused on the effectiveness of the service in reducing potentially avoidable acute admissions, whereas study 2 is actually looking at the multi-component frailty interventions and how it can actually maintain or improve functional status in this select group of pre-frail to moderately frail patients. And these both studies were funded by the Ng Teng Fong Healthcare Innovation Program, National Healthcare Group Singapore. So the first study was a quasi-experimental study. So we had 100 patients, and we were alternating recruitment between intervention and control. Why? Because we actually had study 1 and study 2 both concurrently happening at the same time. So we had to alternate the intervention and control weeks for both study 1 and study 2. And patients were followed up over 1, 3, and 6 months. A bit of a busy table here, but I've just summarized the findings. Essentially, our success rate in acute admission avoidance was as high as 81%. So again, this is when we decide to intervene. These are the patients that we believe can be discharged or at least avoid an acute hospital admission, and we can get it up to 81%. So about 44% end up in the short stay unit, 23% end up in the subacute care unit, 21% goes home, though still about 12% still ends up needing acute hospital admission. Right, so we ran some regression analysis, and essentially we wanted to look at rehospitalization and ED visits, and we were able to show that there was a trend towards lesser risk, but not statistically significant in the intervention group. We were also able to show that there's no significant increase in mortality, which is very important. What we're trying to show here is that despite sending these patients home early or avoiding the need for an acute hospital admission, we did not increase the patient's risk of mortality, right? And we were actually surprised to find that the intervention group actually had lesser progress into a more poorer frailty state. As you can see here, when we adjusted 1, 3, and 6 months, patients were less likely to fall into a worse CFS category. So the conclusions that we could generate is that early geriatric specialist interventions at the front door of acute hospitals can reduce potentially avoidable acute admissions without escalating the risk of rehospitalization, reattendance, or mortality. And acute admission avoidance has the potential to improve health-related outcomes, especially slowing the progression of frailty among all at-risk older adults attending the ED. What about study 2, the multi-component frailty intervention? We recruited 140 patients, alternating weeks as well. We followed them out a bit longer, so 3, 6, and 12 months. And what we were able to show by delivering this frailty package, intervention package, was that there was significantly better odds of improving or maintaining your functional status, both in terms of MBI score, your modified Bartel index, and your Lawton's IADLs at 12 months, right? So for both MBI and Lawton's. What we were also able to show was significantly lesser rate of ED reattendances at 6 months, which the effects somehow seem to have worn off by 12 months. Right, so the conclusion we could generate here was that the multi-component frailty interventions at the front door can maintain or improve functional status among older adults who are 65 and above, but specifically this select group of patients that are pre-frail to moderately frail. And it has the potential to reduce the risk of ED reattendance as well. The other part that I'd just like to touch on briefly is about how we get our assessments, our frailty assessments right at the ED. Right, so in Tan Tock Seng, we actually developed the CFS algorithm, right, and which we validated and has been published. We were trying to find a way where we can standardize how CFS was scored, because we know that CFS can still be somewhat subjective. So we wanted to see how we can make it a little bit more straightforward for people to score them, but not take away too much of the robustness of scoring the CFS. So we came up with this algorithm. I won't go through the details. You can have access to it through this link, this reference. But it's just to show that the inter-rater agreement for this algorithm was pretty good at 0.9 kappa. But of course, this kind of algorithm may not sit so well with certain clinical settings where you need to assess patients very quickly. So we're also looking into how we can develop brief aids to score the CFS at the front door of acute hospitals. So in Tan Tock Seng, we have created the CFS ED, which is a visual aid to score the CFS. And this is actually done by the triage nurses during triaging. So immediately when they come in, they get seen by the triage nurse and they will get a CFS score based on this. The triage nurses do need some training in order to be able to score the patients correctly. The other thing that we created was CFS self. So patients while waiting at the waiting area could possibly even score themselves. They answer this quick questionnaire, and based on what they answer, we could actually score them on the CFS. The only downside to this is that we won't be able to score them through the full breadth of the CFS 1 to 9. We have to collapse them into 5 groups of CFS. So essentially, when they answer the CFS self, we can only score them or categorize them into these 5 groups, right? What we were able to show is that these two brief aids, being the CFS ED and the CFS self, actually had pretty good kappa and agreement with the CFS A, the algorithm, when you divided them into 5 groups at 0.7 and above. Right. So something that we are still looking at, and we are actually going to conduct a validation study to see whether this is actually something worth introducing at the front door, and even maybe in the community setting as well. So really, to summarize most of the points that I'm trying to make here, and this was done very well by this review article by Kenneth Rockwood and his team, written by Olga Theo. Frailty for older adults connotes vulnerability. And the clinical frailty scale, the frailty index, the frailty phenotype, as well as the identification of seniors at risk, are the commonly used sort of tools used to identify frailty at the ED. But I have to say the CFS is really a very attractive tool, and I would recommend considering the CFS at your own centers if you haven't already. An older patient identified as frail should receive an interdisciplinary assessment, which includes a review of their medications and a review of common geriatric problems. And a care plan should be developed for frail older persons and should take into account their individual goals and preferences. Right, so just quick sharing within the next 1 minute about some of my learnings running this service. Essentially, there is no front door geriatric care without an interprofessional team. And I say that because when we try to risk assess a patient for discharge or for a home, we need extra pair of eyes looking at the patient from a PT perspective, from a nursing perspective, from a pharmacist perspective, to be able to make that decision and make it with, knowing that we have a team that have all reviewed the patient from many various angles. Everyone is still learning about frailty care. So what I would say to that is that what I'm preaching to you now, or saying to you now, may not be the best way to provide frailty care, but certainly we are all learning, and we're hoping that more and more research can be done so that we can be guided further on how to provide the right care for our patients. We cannot be too risk adverse, meaning to say that we have to take some risk. When we've assessed the patient and with the extra pair of eyes from all our other allied health and nursing and pharmacists, we should be able to make that decision a bit more easier. And we need to be a bit brave sometimes in deciding whether that patient can be discharged safely or not. Good communication and trust is very important, especially in improving patient care and collaborating with other partners as well, so with our ED colleagues as well as with community partners. And transdisciplinary training is very important here, where as a team, we all try to build each other up and teach each other a little bit of what each of us do. And this is truly the way forward, I think, for front door care, where we all should at least know a little bit of what each other does and how we can deliver some intervention, some PT intervention, some nursing intervention to our patients that we see. So this is the Edify team. Again, it is an interprofessional team, and the Edify wouldn't be successful without all these individuals. So I want to thank them for the work they have done. And thank you for listening to me. And I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of this session. So thank you.
Was an amazing, inspiring talk by Dr. Edward Chong, and also thank you, Leon, for that amazing talk, and also Professor Chen Leong Kong. Professor Chen Leong Kong can't be with us for the question and answer session. I know there are some questions for him. We will try and pass that question on to him at the later, and hopefully he will actually answer you directly. So apologies to that. Okay, now we have bags and bags of questions for Leon and Edward. So Leon, would you like to start? Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so there's this question from Vasi. You have to pick it up. You have to pick up the fight with him later. But so you don't think we need direct evidence about how frailty can be prevented or treated? I.e., are we happy to use indirect evidence from studies on people likely to be frail, even if not formally measured?
Yeah, well, we just heard a lovely presentation about how frailty is measured and dealt with in the ED and in the hospital generally. And one of the things that becomes obvious is that as people get more advanced frailty, comprehensive geriatric assessment is required, and the multidisciplinary team is required. But what you're actually treating is a lot of things all at once. And if I had to explain frailty to my non-geriatric colleagues, I say, the trouble is that you guys are treating the presenting problem, but we're treating the rest as well at the same time. So if you focus on the initial problem, you're going to, with people who are frail, you're not going to be able to deal with the patient. So you're going to have to deal with everything at once. And you're going to have to, and these present with common syndromes. And then you start saying, well, how are we treating frailty? Are we using specific measures? We are, but we're using, 20 or 30 different measures on each patient. And so that's the trouble with the trial. So you end up doing exactly what our colleagues in Singapore are doing, which is you take a group of patients, you have a model of care, and you show results.
Thanks very much, Leon. Okay, let's move on to Edward. Professor Philip Poi would like to ask you this question. End-of-life discussions at ED. How often are these discussions accepted by the next of kin of the patient at that time where there is an apparent acute situation?
First of all, I just want to thank Prof. Poi for asking this question. Actually, it's not there's no easy answer to this. Actually, I'm probably saying this more on behalf of my ED colleagues who actually do most of the work when they bring up end-of-life discussions. And actually, one thing I would say is that not too long ago, in fact, in Singapore, the whole concept of ACP was introduced perhaps about 5 years or 6 years ago. And that became quite a buzz in Singapore, where we were actually even trying to reach out to media, to reach out to people, to make them aware of this whole idea of advanced care planning. So in the ED setting, right, the advantage I suppose we have is that the public are now a little bit more aware about advanced care planning, about the need to talk about EOLs or end-of-life discussions. So it's not usually a big surprise to them when you bring it up, even at the ED setting. But having said that, it is also a situational basis. You know, a patient is very unwell. It's very sudden in terms of the deterioration. Certainly, the family will be, you know, in such a state that it will be very difficult sometimes to make sense of what's happening, and they just want us to do everything we can for them. But I would have to say, from my discussions with my ED colleagues, that discussion has become much easier these days compared to how it used to be before. And the other thing is the patients, not just the patients, but the family members are actually more open to having that kind of conversation, even at the ED. And some of them are actually, you know, they're very much welcome you asking them about it as well, because they're hoping the doctors can direct them and guide them and give them the answers they need in terms of, you know, what kind of extent of care we should actually provide for our loved ones. So the long answer cut short is that it's actually getting easier. Yeah.
Okay, that's given me an idea. You're coming back next year to Kuching to give us a workshop on how to do this at ED. Okay, Dr. Keng Jun Ni asks, and maybe both Leon and Edward can have a go at this question. So not simple and discrete. I think she refers to actually measuring frailty outcomes. There's always the interplay of cognitive impairments, psychosocial, etc. How and what do you think we could use to measure our interventional outcomes if we apply frailty as our core? Leon, do you want to answer this first?
So that's why I'm redefining frailty, actually. So the problem we've had with frailty is that we've tended to treat cognitive impairment as an inconvenient truth. We have not put it into our criteria, and we've been really reluctant to think about it properly. And part of the reason is that we've been hung up with these words like dementia, delirium, and mild neurocognitive disorder. And when we talk to clinicians, everyone talks about patients who look like they have dementia when they're sick, and when they're better, they don't have dementia anymore, right? They're not talking about delirium. They're looking like they have dementia, and then they're going back to something else. So there is this other domain which we're not considering. So if we look at, say, the clinical frailty scale, right, the CFS, the problem with that is that the first three categories are really bad to work out because they're very subjective. The next three are on dependency measures largely. And so we have a dependency scale, and dependency and frailty merge together. Once you get more frailty and dependency, they come together. So the trouble is working out frailty before you have dependency. Now, when you're coming into hospitals, it makes a lot of sense to look at moderately severe frailty. But in the community and other places, you're trying to look at mild frailty, and the CFS isn't great for that. So what you're looking at is the loss of physiological redundancy in systems with not necessarily any dependency yet. When you're looking at mild neurocognitive disorder, there is no dependency associated with it by definition. So you're looking at a loss of cognitive ability before there are clinical problems. So these are the issues we're all having. And what we're trying to do on those milder stages is trying to work out what we're doing. And if you're ignoring the cognition aspects too much, it doesn't work. And that's why we've struggled. We've always had clinical frailty plus cognitive assessment as well. It's what you end up doing to make it work, right? That's the inconvenient truth. I notice that Edward's nodding his head. You know, this is just what happens. 3 cheers. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. And Edward, would you like to pipe in as well?
No, I mean, I totally agree with Prof. Flicker on that. I suppose just to add on, I like the 5N. Why? Because of what matters most, the fifth part of it. And really, I think we need to look at patients from that perspective, right? We need to look at what matters most to them, and not so much what is the matter of with the patient, you know what I mean? So I think that's another key thing that we should, although we can't quite measure it, it's a very important part of what we should be doing in terms of looking at the patient's psychosocial dimensions of needs and things like that. So I fully agree with what Prof. Flicker had said as well.
Thanks very much. Okay, you don't get off so lightly, Edward. I will get you to answer one more question. Okay, so based from your experience, what's the average time spent per case from admission, from assessment to discharge? Because in Malaysia, they always say this, by the way, because in Malaysia, we have problems with beds pending in ED. I think that's a universal problem, I should believe, yes.
It is. Yeah, well, in Tan Tock Seng, we're no different. Our bed occupancy rate is always 90% or even more than that. So I suppose what we do is immediately once ED physicians see them, and they usually don't spend too long to assess patients and decide for admission, we already screen them. So our APN, our advanced practitioners, screen the patient and see, oh, okay, this patient we might need to do something about, we could intervene, and that's when we'll come in. But the APN actually does most of the work. She'll review the patient, she'll speak to the family, she'll see whether or not she can actually get them home. So on average, she spends about 20 minutes, 30 minutes trying to get all that sorted first. And once she feels, oh, yes, we could do something to get the patient home, that's when she triggers the rest of the team to come in. And that's when we will come in, we'll review the patient, and if we can get the patient home, we'll discharge them. So on average, about an hour, but it really varies depending on what we need to arrange for the patient. So if we need to get a patient back to nursing home, we need to call the nursing home and discuss with them the case. To the hospice, we need to work with our palliative colleagues to try and get them to a hospice as well. So it varies. On average, we spend perhaps about an hour in total to try to get most things done. Some patients, we've had to even spend up to 2 to 3 hours get everything done before they get home.
Yeah, that seems like a challenging thing for the Malaysian at the moment. Okay, so maybe let's have one more question because there's 1 more minute left. Very short answer. Leon, this question says that they actually agree with frailty as one core giant. We cannot apply ICF framework on management of frailty in older patients. The disabilities and functional impairments are giant. Yeah. So what I think this question is trying to ask is, are disabilities and functional impairments also considered part of the frailty giant?
Yeah, and it is tough, but the trouble we have, there are two concepts there, and they converge together. So as frailty becomes more and more severe, you must have dependency, because you've lost enough physiological redundancy in systems that you can no longer perform your activities of daily living. So dependency and advanced frailty will merge. And so, for example, when you were doing the frailty index, everybody who was 0.5 and above, about to, a lot of those people died, but all of them had dependency. You couldn't have that sort of extreme frailty without dependency as well. And then, so you have this problem that on the early part of the scale, dependency is not very good because you've lost physiological redundancy, but you don't necessarily have any dependency. And as you go through, you can have quite advanced loss of physiological redundancy with relatively little dependency. But as you progress through, it becomes more and more commonplace.
Great, thanks very much for that nice and short answer. Thanks very much, Leon, and thanks very much, Edward, for the brilliant talk and wonderful question and answer section. I'd like to encourage everyone to move on to the plenary session now, where you get to listen to me talk for the next hour. Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye.